Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone. This is Nelson for GamesMatter. Hashtag GamesMatter. Today I have with me the amazing Kenny Bacchus. Bacchus, dear Lord, I jacked it up already. And today we're playing his incredible game, Skyrogue, doing an event for it over at GamesMatter HQ on Twitter. You can pick up a copy today, or you can support the developer by buying the game. It just released on Steam Early Access. You can get it on itch.io and etc. Really great. It's the most swooshy air combat arcade permadeath roguelike-ish thingy you're ever going to play. Without further ado, Kenny, how you doing today, man?
Hey, hello. Doing pretty alright.
So,
Yeah.
Skyrogue, how did you even come up with this idea?
So it sort of started back in about 2009. At TIG Source, there was this cockpit competition, basically, a month-long online game jam. And I made this like hard sci-fi space sim where your targets are hundreds of kilometers away. That was actually even slightly unrealistic. They should be like millions of kilometers away, and you didn't see hardly anything, and you just sort of operated through your instruments. But anyways, the whole point of this is that at the end, I thought I want to make another sort of flying, vehicle sim game of some kind. And another one of the guy who actually made Venus Patrol, of Venus Patrol fame, of the completely unrelated site. I talked to him a bit because we were both sort of interested in flight sims, combat flight sims, and I basically discussed this idea of what was basically a roguelike flight simulator, and this was 2009, so this was before roguelike was sort of a buzzword. It was very much an obscure thing that, I think Spelunky was out. That was the only example of any sort of roguelite, or whatever you want to call it, some sort of game that combined the permadeath and procedural generation with some other genre. So yeah, I thought it was a cool idea. I started making a prototype of some kind using Ogre 3D. This was also before Unity was free. It was only a few months before Unity was free, actually. And yeah, that didn't really get anywhere. So that idea just sort of sat around in my head for a while. I tried it again in Unity later with this bombing run prototype, and I keep meaning to try to dig up the screenshots from old Image Shack accounts and other things like that and see if I can recover something. And that was, yeah, as you might suspect, I said bombing run. So it was a game that was more just specifically about bombing things and making a very good bombing experience. And that of course didn't really get anywhere either. And then finally, 2013, there's this website called onegameamonth.com, run by Chris Caplia. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. I don't know.
Yeah, he's an awesome dude.
Yeah. So for that I made 12 games in a year, once a month, like the name of the site. So when one of the months it was July, came around, I thought, oh well, I have this idea sitting around. Let's see if I could make the simplest possible version of this idea. I didn't really get around to the roguelike part, but I did get basically the action flight sim part down by the end of the month.
I'm sorry to
yeah.
say this, but I'm super disappointed that there isn't a dedicated barrel roll button.
There's an arrow dodge, but that's technically this weird aileron roll, but you're also sidestepping, which is totally unrealistic, but it looks cool and it's very effective.
Awesome.
But there's this YouTube video. I don't know if you've seen it, which specifies to hilarious effect that a barrel roll in Star Fox is actually an aileron roll. When you're going straight and you just sort of go 360 on your Z-axis, you roll the whole way around. An actual barrel roll is when you kind of pull up on the stick and to the right, so you kind of make this big barrel-shaped sort of path, and then you try to make sure you kind of come back to the same flight path. And what that really does is it just bleeds some airspeed so that, like, if someone's behind you, you can get behind them maybe. And that's what a real barrel roll is, and that's what you do with it.
And that's actually a really interesting thing. Like, when you're creating a air combat game and you're not adhering strictly to simulation principles, how do you decide what makes it in and what does not? What's too crazy? Especially when you've added modding support, which, as people can see, I was just playing as a golden TIE fighter, and now I have regular ships with TIE fighter skins, and I downloaded that mod off of the Steam Workshop. I do not regret it at all.
Yeah. So, right. Well, the mods are a great way of just letting people do whatever the hell they want. So, like, there's a mod for a table. I want to make a GIF of that sometime. Like, the game or it looks really good in GIF form on Tumblr. I post a lot. But anyways, more to your question. I would say, like, I want to keep it inside the domain of action flight simulator. What I mean by that is the basics of your experience have some semblance, some link to reality. Like, it's not too amazingly abstract. And what I mean by that is specifically no floating power-ups that you, like, fly into. That actually makes the roguelike aspect a lot harder to implement. I can get into details about that, but also not only that, but also when you like go to the left or right, to make it feel like a flight sim, you roll, left or right, and you can yaw, but it's very slow, just like an real aircraft. And generally the way that you want to turn is, you want to, like, bank, you want to roll a bit and then pull up and execute a turn that way. But in, like, more arcade games, or more specifically in arcadey portions of games unrelated to flight, like GTA, basically, like the fighter jet in GTA, specifically so that people basically won't constantly crash into things, they make it so that if you, like, press right, it'll go ahead and bank to the right for you.
And you want to also give that ability directly to the players so they can do, like, all sorts of crazy stuff.
Yeah, and also, more on that. No, like, auto maneuvering, because, like, if you play Star Fox 64, when you're in the, I think it's all range mode, the all range mode sections, which is a way of saying, like, these small arenas where you can free fly in. There's, like, a button that you can press to do a Immelman turn, basically, but it calls it a U-turn or something, which is, like, like, for flight sim nerds, that's, like, I don't know, that's a GIF reaction GIF. That inspires a GIF
literally
reaction
painful.
GIF. Yeah. But anyways, so nothing like that. And it's really because I want the flying experience to be genuine. I don't want to use the word authentic because it's not really a realistic flight model. It's not trying to be at all. But genuine, at least in the sort of the way it feels and the way it controls.
Okay.
So yes, that's the extreme I don't want to go to. And on the other hand, I don't want to go to the extreme of modern flight simulators, which, thanks to the past 2 decades of advances in computer hardware, are actual really good. They're epitomes of the word simulator. They're actually simulating something, but you have to go through a checklist just to start your engines and, like, taxi off the runway and stuff. And maybe watch a 10 or 15 minute YouTube video just so you can get started. And I wanted to not have a game like that. I wanted more like, well, Ace Combat is obviously a major inspiration here, but something that just gets you into the air quicker, and you have infinite ammo, and it's a bit wacky, so you're, like, firing zillions of missiles and such. So definitely more of an experience that is accessible, maybe to, well, not just accessible to people who don't like flight sims, people who haven't really played flight sims, but also just accessible to people who maybe like the flight sims of the 90s, which really weren't so complicated, and kind of miss that ability to to just sort of hop in and fool around, that you don't really, well, you know, depending on your settings, you can get in modern flight sims, but modern flight sims don't necessarily care so much if you're having fun or not. They're more about actually being a simulator.
Yeah. So you actually spoke about the difficulties implementing rogue-like elements have arisen. Words are not coming to me today. What have been the difficulties of making like this a roguelike? Because as people have seen, every time I start a level, it's procedurally generated. What enemies and their configurations come up, that's all procedurally generated too. So yeah, what difficulties came from that? Not just making an air sim, but one that you could play over and over and over.
Yeah, it's very much with the sort of the design side, and what I wanted to do from the start was basically see what happens if I wanted to make what felt as a designer like a literal transplant of a roguelike into a flight sim. So, you know, you go through these islands which are sort of like dungeons of sorts, sort of like levels in, you know, NetHack or whatever.
Yeah.
So they're these small self-contained environments, and along with that, and along with not having like floaty power-ups that you pick up midair, you'll immediately notice like, oh well, I can, in this dungeon in the sky, I can sort of just fly to the exit immediately because I'm in the air and there's nothing in the way. And so that meant like, oh well, you can fly straight to the mission target if you want to. So I need to like design the rest of the targets to be highly optional, but give you some sort of like what reason, basically right now just to gather resources, but there's probably going to be more exciting reasons to attack the other targets. But yeah, give you more interesting reasons to actually slow yourself down, basically. And also with on the item side, like not being able to just randomly pick up things floating through the air. A lot of roguelikes do a big part of the experience is just finding new loot that is like bizarre and strange, and sitting around and inspecting it and such, and doing all these things that you can't do if there's not floating. A, if there's not floating power-ups, and B, if you're constantly in flight and might crash if you spend too much time just ogling loot. So, I've had to basically move all the item stuff into the intermission, the carrier menu, basically. And all of your gaining of items as this more abstract process. So that was a challenge, just because I couldn't sort of directly transplant something and really had to think about it, basically.
So a lot of thought went into something that someone might look at and be like, oh, that was simple. Actually, a lot of thought went into it.
Oh yeah, that's definitely the case in games in general. Like, I've watched some of the devs play videos where like
by Double Fine.
Yeah, like namely like the Castlevania and the Doom ones, and even like the tiniest things either have like so much thought behind them, or okay, it's usually one thing or the other. It's either like a small, seemingly minor detail has a ton of thought behind it, or like they're following some sort of strict rules that you didn't even know existed to come about with that sort of design or that content. And then on the other hand, especially with Symphony of the Night, you'll think like, whoa, this thing seems so intentional, but it was really just like, well, someone just made a decision and we went with it and left it alone. And sometimes that happens. I'm sure that's somewhere in Skyrogue as well, and I just can't think of it right now.
So, how did you get started with game development? Did you immediately, the first day, you just cracked your fingers and then out came Skyrogue?
No, certainly not. And well, maybe it's just because I follow a bunch of game devs, but I think by now it's fairly obvious that people in general, at least in creative, industries, generally aren't overnight successes. It's more like you see there's this long line of either failures or just kind of, mediocre or hobby work leading up to it. But in any case, yeah. So I've been working in AAA games from about 2008 to just last year, 2014. And before that, I had actually made this. Well, I made this one game in class with the C++ and OpenGL, and then before that, long before that, with this game creation, or these two game creation programs, one called ZZT and another called Click and Play. I made various things. Yeah.
So, having used Click and Play, all that different stuff, those kind of simple early game dev tools actually led you to where you are today.
Yeah, very gradually. I would there's this interim period that I guess I didn't mention where I actually got interested in just computer programming in general. And I would say sort of between high school and the end of college, I sort of realized that it's much more complicated than you might think. And I thought well, maybe I should just sort of focus on learning web development and get a job in web development, which I actually did out of college. But no, I kind of came back around and basically found a job in the gaming industry 2008. And from there, I've been making stuff on the side for a very long time. Hey, sorry, I just have to take a call real quick.
No problem.
I'm very sorry about this.
To those watching, all of these R-Wings, those are not in the game by default. This is another mod. Let's see. Do I want to play as a member of the Cornian Air Force? Maybe the R-Wing again? TIE Fighter? Let's go back to one of the default fighters. I think I'm going to go with a heavy micro missile because we're dealing with some giant moving targets. Rocket, of course, flare. Now this aft-launched micro missile looks interesting. If I can manage to avoid enemy fire long enough to deploy it. So here's flares, here's the micro missile. I'm gonna go with the micro missile.
Hey, I'm back.
Hey,
sorry about that.
I've just been narrating my terrible weapon choices.
Yes. That thing, the ALM, I have these super technical names for things, which is sort of standard in flight sims or any sort of military sim. But at the same time, I try to give them real names, basic names a human might choose. Anyways, yeah, that thing, the Scorpion, is the latest weapon I've made, actually.
What is your weapon making process?
So generally, the way it first started out was basically looking at real world weapon or air-to-air and aircraft weapons in general, and thinking, what are the interesting parts of this, and how can I put it in the game in a way that isn't just sort of including it because it also exists in the real world. So that means things like infrared guidance, but modern infrared missiles, you don't have to actually be behind the target, but in any case, for gameplay reasons, it's more interesting to have that limitation. There's also it's only with the very long range missile and the MRRV missile. It's this thing called semi-active guidance, where sort of missiles from the air-to-air missiles from the 70s and before, so vaguely Vietnam era. They would require you to, you have a radar on your F4 Phantom or whatever, and it would require you to sort of keep the target right in front of you inside of your radar for the entire extent that the missile was airborne, because it was basically helping it guide it to the target. So you have to keep it inside your little ring, and that's sort of an interesting like micro gameplay thing. It was originally like on some other missiles, but I noticed like it made them harder to use in more annoying ways. So I sort of made them just fire and forget. And then from there, yeah, I just basically I try to add just sort of ideas that myself or Charles have, but always I try to strive to make it feel like something that you use at least in a slightly different way from everything else. And I try to avoid transient weapons, and transient is sort of a game design term for like the pistol in Doom. When you get the chain gun, you really don't have a reason to have the pistol anymore, because the chain gun is pretty much better in every way. So I try to like it's sort of helped by this you know, like loadout system with this payload and avionics. If there's like sort of a weaker weapon, then well, it inherently costs less to fit on your aircraft, so that still, you know, could be useful in some ways. Or like specifically like the rocket and the heavy rocket. Well, the heavy rocket, of course, it does a lot more damage total, but it's a bit less accurate, and so it's a bit more for you know, bigger targets. Whereas if you want to be very precise, you'd actually might want to just get a bunch of light rockets. So basically, little considerations like that. And like, you know, the heavy bomb, effectively, the main unguided bomb versus the cluster one. They have slightly different damage outputs, and you know, one of them is cluster, one of them is very direct. So, you know, basically they work differently, and I always want to kind of keep something like that going. Like, I don't really want to make just a bigger bomb. Like, okay, well, it's a bigger bomb, but it has a big area of effect, or it does something else interesting. And that's probably why the output of the number of weapons in the game has slowed down a bit as we go along, just because, you know, it's harder to make a new weapon interesting. But we still got, you know, ideas, and we still got things we're going to do that we're going to keep secret because it's more exciting that way.
Perfect. So as far as Skyrogue, it seems the process is very much keep it simple and just continue iterating on something that's good already. So has there been something either too crazy or too simulation-like that you had to specifically take out? Or something that was actually a good idea and any other game would just be good, but here it just didn't work?
There were probably a few other things that I just don't come to mind. The one thing that does come to mind is that there were these things called aero mods that were like their own slot on the aircraft that I had added basically at the same time as the other weapons. And all they really did was sort of tweak on your aircraft, and I felt like they were sort of fun to in a mech warrior sort of way of like min-maxing or making very minor tweaks to your aircraft, like you might in mech warrior, taking a very, very slightly bigger engine or a very, very slightly smaller engine or whatever for some micro optimization. But it seemed like it was making the different aircraft less interesting, because you could take, you know, a light fighter or whatever and just give it the aero mod that makes it faster but less maneuverable, and now you have what is mostly like the light interceptor. So basically it just wasn't really interesting enough, and I felt like leaning on the side of minimalism there, so I actually took it out. And people complained a bit, which I was actually very surprised of, but I think it's just because I don't know, I've been making games for almost a decade now, so you know, minimalism and just sort of taking away things that aren't really great ideas just seems natural to me, but I don't think it's always natural to players.
And that's actually a really good point. Like, over time, have you noticed that your confidence in your game development decisions, especially even just for Skyrogue, as you kind of figure out what you want this game to be, that you're growing more confident with those decisions over time?
Yeah. Especially like with any game, I think what happens as you develop it is you get a better idea of what it actually is, and this vision is actually I've learned over time it's very critical to creating a game, especially in a team environment, especially.
Because
That
you aren't
is,
just a
first of
solo
all, actually going to
developer
get.
making Skyro.
Yeah. But Charles doing the art and Eirik doing the music. But it is just us for now. But I'm thinking back like to like my AAA experience. Like the biggest team was Far Cry 4, of like 400 odd people spread across the world. You know, gigantic. And the vision there, the vision for Skyrogue, of course. Well, I've talked about it effectively a lot already, but it's become increasingly more clear. Like the fact that there are these flying carriers. Just a quick aside. The reason they exist is because originally they were just normal sea-based carriers, but I thought that people would do better. Like people who aren't really into flight sims would do a lot better if they started off in the air. Just because people who don't play flight sims don't really think about gaining altitude for altitude's sake as much.
Yeah.
So they might basically crash a lot easier in an uninteresting, way. So I just sort of start the player launching in the air from an aircraft carrier because that's cool.
The aircraft carrier is a mother throwing the baby out of the nest.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. But yeah, this vision, like things like that, and especially some of the newer aircraft designs look a bit more like they come out of a shmup. Things about like what the game is and what are the rules about the way it should look or play are becoming increasingly clear with each new version. And yeah, that I've worked on games projects where people didn't really know what the game was supposed to be, and then I worked on projects like Far Cry 4 where it was like Far Cry 3 was a big success. Let's make another success. So we have this prequel. We're making a sequel. So it's pretty obvious what we should be doing here. At least like 80% of the game is a done deal.
Yeah.
So.
Iteration.
Yeah. So that vision.
Like you see in indie, like they had a very successful game. They kind of take a similar pattern for the next one, although in a different setting, etc.
Mhm. Yeah. It's I would say, like, you probably know if you've been playing games for decades, sequels have gotten a bit more repetitive in a good way, like more of iterations on the same concept, whereas I think in the 90s and before, especially just because the technology was advancing so quickly, like sequels always had to be like fundamentally different, and usually that didn't always really work out.
From Wing Commander to Luke Skywalker. Wing Commander.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good point.
So,
but,
yeah, as far as Skyro, we've been playing. How long have we been playing? Someone says, now, thank God you left out into Ubisoft and that you're now making indie games.
Yeah.
So, was it scary to make the decision, okay, I'm going to leave this huge established game company and do my own thing?
To clarify, I took the coward's way out. I actually started working for a company in Norway remotely called Snow Castle, and we're making an RPG called Earthwalk. Shameless plug for the day job there, as I probably should do. But I actually encouraged the coward's way out, because it's much scarier than it even was like in 2010 or 2012 to just quit and go 100% indie. But in any case, yeah. In any case, it was still a big transition. And
did you find that you had to change some of your work habits as a result?
Yeah, for sure. Like, just sort of my coworkers at Snow Castle, and also just working with Charles. Things that well, I can't go into too much detail, but things that Ubisoft were just very, like, they really know how to get a game out there, and, you know, very disciplined. That's the word I should be using, disciplined. So, disciplined in a good way. I actually sort of liked seeing that, because I don't think any of the companies I worked for before, like Funcom, were very particularly disciplined. And what that means is just, like, you know, like, there was, well, yeah. It's just, well, yeah, I don't know how much detail I can go to, so sorry to be sort of...
Yeah, you don't have to be, you don't have to go into detail, but needless to say...
But, anyways, yeah, it was a change in just sort of the day-to-day work habits, I guess. And how things are now a bit more relaxed in a way that I'm not always comfortable with, but then occasionally it's comforting because sometimes I do just need to relax. Yeah, but it's certainly an interesting experience and transition. And also, like, actually, probably the most important difference was just, and I had plenty of preparation making my own games with this, but just the idea that it's everyone's game, and if you see something that needs to be done, there's like a 50% chance you should maybe just do it yourself if you're able to. Even if it's not like, you know, if it's strictly a designer thing to do, or it's strictly an art side thing to do, well, can you like throw together a particle effect or something and do it yourself real quick? And yeah, I think the cliche is wearing different hats, or the cliched term at least. And that certainly happens a lot with Skyrogue or Earthlock or any sort of small team game.
Interesting. I just got a heavy Vulcan and I missed out on the arrow dodge. I'm thinking that might have been a bad idea now. Gosh, dang it. I'm hoping this thing was worth it.
I've actually not, what I'm very surprised about is I've not seen anyone talk about the tech progression. Like, there's actually a tech tree and you just don't see it at all. It just happens that you have 3 options and you get a random sampling of all the techs you can get based on the techs you have. And I'm slightly surprised that no one's like gone through and figured out exactly what requires what.
Would you like to talk about that?
Well, it's just sort of how I said, like, it's, you start off with 3 choices, it's always the same 3 choices, but as you research stuff, it will make other things accessible, but you don't see a tree, you don't get sort of a bird's eye view of it at any point, and you just sort of get a random draw of 3. That wasn't particularly intentional, other than maybe, like, this is like going back to talking about Symphony of the Night, sometimes things just being random.
Yeah.
I think I was just playing lots of board games at the time, maybe, and I thought, like, cards are cool, aren't they? So let's do a random draw of something to make it a bit more, you know, varied, but have some sort of sensible progression, so you don't like get the super awesome planes at the beginning. So yeah, I guess that's worked out because no one's complaining.
Do you plan to tweak that tech progression in the future going forward, though?
Probably, yeah, but probably more with like how the items work. Like, I don't know if it seems like it's a bit of a high friction decision to make you lose your equipment when you die in a game like Spelunky, where you always start off with nothing, and that's okay because you don't have a huge verb set anyways.
Yeah.
That seems fine, but in a game...
familiar with that term, what is a verb set?
Oh, like, basically the things you can do as a player character. So, like in Spelunky, you can jump, you can whip, you can move left or right or run. When you get the jetpack, now you have a new verb that's called jetpack that you can jetpack around with. So, basically,
okay.
Yeah, with Skyrogue, well, I mean, you know, you can shoot weapons, but there's lots of different weapons that behave differently. So you can bomb versus rocket, and those are sort of different, at least in terms of like learning how to attack things. Those are different verbs that you need to learn separately. Well, not separate, they're very, you know, they're all about aiming, obviously, but they're still sort of different skills.
And that's why I've been losing the weapons I currently had equipped whenever I die. I was wondering why that
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably one of the most unclear parts of the game. And I try to do, I try to go with design things just in general with all games in a way that it will hopefully mostly explain itself just by seeing how things work. Like I don't have to explicitly explain things. Other than like in the tutorial, you know, you get you get to know all the possible controls that you can be using, which is important, and it's important to get started at all. And just the basic idea of, yeah, this is how you lock onto a target, this is how things blow up. There's ground target, you know, mission target, you blow those up to complete the mission. Basically, you know, like super simple details. But beyond that, I sort of want things to just sort of hopefully explain themselves, because, well, first of all, just so people don't have to go through like a bombing tutorial, but also just because if they did go through a bombing tutorial, like they probably wouldn't read the text, and you know, they'd probably like half learn it or something. Or basically, I want to design it in a way that it wasn't really important to read the text in the first place.
Exactly. And so, how much difficulty have you had with something that, again, people look at it and it seems simple, but communicating all of the different ideas and what your game uniquely brings to the table, not only in terms of for playing, helping players, but also in terms of just marketing the game. How have you done that? How have you approached that challenge?
So there have been sort of two major challenges that come to mind. One of them is a bit more like sort of technical than the other. I'll start with like the Star Fox comparison, which I actually enjoy quite a bit, just because I also like Star Fox, and I especially like the graphics of it, the original one. But it does sometimes create this expectation that it's going to be a rail shooter, and it's definitely not a rail shooter.
Unless you're talking about the rail that you're getting impaled on as you die over it.
Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely a game where you get full control, 6 degrees of freedom, but you also need to actually, you know, effectively control yourself in those 6 degrees of freedom. And I haven't tried to specifically fight it or anything, because like I said, I sort of like the comparison because it gets people excited, but I also don't want to mislead them, so I'm just hoping, like, just even looking at the trailer or looking at Let's Plays, it's pretty obvious that you're free-flying, that you're doing lots of, in Star Fox terms, complicated maneuvers, and things are a bit more technical and flight simmy than Star Fox.
Is there an element of strategy, like if I destroy this carrier, will more enemies not respawn?
Certainly, yeah. On this island, of course, like no more enemies will spawn from the carrier because the carrier spawns enemies. There's also like a little a very subtle detail that you can notice that I'll leave to players to tell when there's actually no more aircraft on the carrier to spawn. It will slowly like regenerate those though, but there's an indicator telling you what's up with that. But in any case, yeah, blowing up the carrier, of course, will make, you know, aircraft not spawn from there anymore. So that makes, you know, if you want to bomb stuff or whatever, that makes that simpler to do.
And so you don't have to specifically tell players that. It's kind of simple.
Yeah. An aircraft carrier has aircraft, it launches aircraft. If you blow it up, it can't launch any more aircraft. Therefore, there's less aircraft in the air that went to kill you. So, yeah, sort of self-explanatory stuff like that.
So, as far as player reactions, what's been the most surprising thing that people have understood immediately or have not understood immediately?
Not understood, I think, is that there's sort of two ties for first place there. First of all, people, if they haven't played flight games at all, just understanding that the most effective way to turn is to you know, bank, to roll to the right or left and then pull up, whereas they just sort of want to press left and go left.
Yeah.
And they don't really know that, and so it is a bit of a leap, because rolling feels very unstable if you're not used to doing that. And it's very easy to roll too much, and then you're sort of dipping down, And you know, it can be very chaotic and hard to get used to that sort of way of flying. And then the other one is even if you kind of do know how to fly, just targeting something, locking on, and firing missiles in a way that they're actually going to hit the target. And if you've played like Ace Combat or other flight sims or action flight sims, it's pretty obvious how that works, but it was something that honestly I was a bit blind to. Just there's sort of this verb chain, to use the term verb again, of okay, you target, and then you aim, so you get them inside your little cone there, and then you wait for the lock to happen. You actually have to be in range for that to even start, and it's sort of hard to communicate that visually if you're not in range yet. And I'll probably add some sort of reticle ding animation to make that more obvious. And then so you get in range, and then you lock on, and that means the diamond goes on top of the box, which is like pretty obvious if you watched like Top Gun, but maybe you haven't watched Top Gun, and so you actually don't know that.
You haven't gone to the danger zone yet.
Yeah, exactly. So, so even just like sort of that iconography, which is universal in flying games, is not universal in general. So yeah, just having it lock on and then firing and knowing that the missiles you just shot are trying to guide. And I've done two things to help with that. First of all, you'll notice unless you turn off auto target, if you turn to face something and it's sort of the only thing in front of you, it will just target it automatically. Because I noticed a lot of people would just not target things before they tried to fire their missiles. And secondly, if you do fire your missiles and they don't have a lock for some reason, or the enemy dodges or whatever, there's these little X's that go on top of them to make it obvious that, you know, they're not guiding, they're useless now. And that seems like just playtesting, seeing people play it in front of you, that seems to have helped a lot with that difficulty of just sort of doing one of the most basic actions in the game.
Have Let's Plays and streams helped in that regard as well? Showing...
Yeah.
So you can, like, never before have people been able to actually see viscerally how people approach their game?
Yeah, like, otherwise you just have to actually get someone sitting in front of you to play the game. And one interesting thing that isn't obvious to new game developers is that when you want to play test, you generally want as little communication as possible with the player. And with a Let's Play, that's completely, you know, impossible to do in the first place. So, or at least with a YouTube one, not a Twitch stream. So you do get an idea of how the game plays, not only with like no instruction from the developer, but also without the developer standing there, you know, emotionally invested in the game you're playing, and maybe not wanting to disappoint them or something. So you get, you know, more not only honest feedback, but also just you notice things you never noticed if you, like if you said, like if I said, oh, you have to target targets first, so press this button, you know, before you get in front of your target. Well, I can't really do that with a Let's Player, so maybe they're just going to fly towards it and then fire their missiles wildly and nothing will happen. So yeah, it's been really very useful in that regard, and something that is very useful for today's game designers that the ones of yesteryear did not have.
Ah man, I am so afraid of the ground now with all these missiles.
Right. It's actually fairly easy to dodge missiles, but you kind of just need to, like you basically just need to move out of the way, but that can get hairy if there's a lot of them, so then you're sort of always moving out of the way. And so I'm trying to find a balance there between, like, okay, you have to dodge a lot so you don't die, but you also have these windows where you can definitely fight back. And there was an issue a little earlier where, like, in later levels there were just so many enemies at the beginning that you just never really got that window. So I've been tweaking it slowly, spacing things out a bit more in later levels so that you aren't necessarily dodging things all the time.
And actually, that's an interesting design challenge that you bring up. Turbo Vulcan. Sure. There we go, Turbo Vulcan. But yeah, that's an interesting thing that you bring up there. How do you, it being a roguelike, necessarily you say, okay, it's going to be difficult by its very nature. But how do you make sure it's not too difficult? Like, at first, I could barely clear the first screen. Now I can consistently get to the second, but I can never pass the third, at least during this Let's Play. So, how do you approach tweaking difficulty?
So, I of course need to mention Dark Souls, because
Obligatory.
it's a yeah, it's obligatory if you're talking about high difficulty and what high difficulty done well actually means. But more specifically, there's this game that I made called Swords a few years ago, which was heavily inspired by Bastion and like basically just its combat system, not really its narrative at all, but Bastion and beat-em-ups and such. And the rule there, which I'm also pretty much following with Skyrim, there's like a few edge cases which are a little wonky, is that you could potentially avoid all damage that will ever occur in the game. Like, you could theoretically play Dark Souls, for example, from beginning to end and not take any damage at all if you were just that awesome. And that's something that I try to do also in Skyrim. And there are like things like just like the anti-aircraft guns, the fact that they fire in these sort of slightly randomized cones is actually works against that. But in that case, for complicated reasons that I don't even think I can really express well, I just basically made it fire less and slower, and in a way that it felt like it wasn't super accurate, but also didn't feel like if you got hit it was super random. And also they do so little damage that it's not that big of a deal, but still, it's basically what I'm trying to get at is if I mean, in any action game where you have like health or you have bullets or some other sort of thing that's coming towards you that will kill you, and getting killed is a failure state. In any sort of game like that, well, as you might be able to surmise from how I just described it, one way to win is to not die before you even start fighting anything. So making it so that you can easily, or if you pay attention and you're good and you develop skills, you can always not die, is a great first step towards getting something that can be very difficult but also extremely fair. And it is a bit challenging to do that at times with in sort of the flight sim environment, because of just the way sort of weapons aim and work and the fact that a lot of them are guided. So it's not as straightforward as it was like with Swords, which is like a melee combat game. But I still try to do that. And one thing that I want to do, which isn't really, well, first of all, the game doesn't even end yet, so, and also I think the later levels are probably a bit too hard, is that I want you to be able to theoretically start the game with the default basic loadout that you get from basically zero progression, and be able to beat the game that way. Like,
a little bit like Loot Trousers, which you actually have a skin as an homage to.
Yes, yes.
Love that game.
Yeah, actually, I met both developers actually separately now. I've met Rami and I've met Jan Willem.
That's awesome.
Very cool people. Jan Willem is very funny. He has a strange sense of humor. But anyways, yeah. So like, of course, that's the Luftrausers cameo is completely supported and kosher with them.
The TIE Fighter thing is totally supported by LucasArts.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. No, that's half the reason why I did mod support, is so that people could like make TIE Fighters or Star Fox and make it so that I wouldn't get sued because it's not actually an official part of the game.
All the things that you would like to do but can't.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, speaking of, you just launched on Steam in early access.
Yes. Yes.
And Matt, has that helped with all the things you've spoken about, like tweaking the game, the difficulties you had? Launching in early access, has that helped there? Because you don't have the pressure of a full launch and getting it right first time.
Yeah, I would say that that early access is a bit of in terms of like not being a real full launch, is a bit of a dupe, or I don't know a good word. I don't want to say scam. Misnomer. That's a much better word. There we go. It's a bit of a misnomer because what you'll notice is like a lot of people still just sort of treat it as a full game, and they'll say stuff like, I know it's an alpha, or I know it's an early access, but I'll say these things and be, angry or leave a bad review or whatever. But, I guess it's better than not having it at all, especially for these sorts of gameplay, crunchy, mechanics-driven games, which actually do fit well with the model. But anyways, to actually answer your question, yeah, it certainly helped. I think with the itch.io version, I didn't, and also just playtesting in front of other people, I didn't get enough feedback and see enough other people's experiences in the later levels. Just because, like, if it was in person, well, like, they'd play for 15 or 30 minutes, which is probably the most critical part of any gameplay session, at least as a developer. But, it's still important if you have a game that plays for several hours or more, that, hour 5, hour 10 is interesting, and there's a reason why the player wants to go to hour 6 or hour 11. So, just basically playing the later levels is something that didn't happen enough. And it was there's still a bit like, some people call it like a difficulty brick wall, and also something randomly, mission target randomly blew up. Anyways, yeah, this difficulty brick wall, and it was a much sort of bigger problem earlier, basically at the beginning of launch week, until I sort of spaced out the enemies a bit more in the later levels. And yeah, basically the reason that happened is just because I sort of didn't spend enough time on those later levels and making sure that they were playable. Like, I think I just sort of thought like, oh yeah, it's super difficult because the game doesn't really have an ending yet, so I just sort of want, it's sort of okay if the game sort of becomes just incredibly hard, but it's still not really okay.
Air dodge is the best thing ever.
Yeah, actually, I think I might even want to make it like some sort of default thing, but I don't know. I need to figure out how to do that well.
A lot of game development is just thinking about the best way to do something.
Yeah, like, you can have all sorts of ideas, and a lot of them can even be good ideas, but making it actually work with the rest of the game can be really difficult. And especially if you're making a game where the vision is, hey, let's, like, Skyrogue is somewhat this case, in this domain of, hey, let's take an old genre that doesn't get too much attention and then, make a new game with some more modern sensibilities. Well, sometimes you can say, oh, well, this game from 1995 did it this way for this, detail. So let's just do exactly what they did, because it worked for them. And that doesn't really always work well. Actually, it usually doesn't work well at all. It's what I call cargo cult design, because cargo cult thinking is like, well, the analogy, I don't know if you or the listeners are aware of it, but it's like these Pacific Islanders who, during World War II, they would have these airdrops of supplies for some reason or another. And of course, those aren't going to last forever, so they're these tribes that are mostly disconnected from civilization, so they don't really know about, what airplanes are really. So they sort of think like there's these supply drops that come, and then they suddenly stop, so we want those supply drops to come again. Well, let's create the circumstances around which the supply drops occurred, therefore they'll happen, which is faulty logic. But what I just described is also sometimes the way that games can be designed, where let's just make it work exactly like this cool classic game, in this particular part of our game, even though the rest of the game is, its own game or whatever. Maybe it doesn't mesh well at all, or maybe even back then it was sort of a bad idea. Let's just do it because it was good in that case, and therefore it will be good in our case. And yeah, I try to avoid that, and everyone should try to avoid that. Which is why, when you have an idea that was cool in another game, or if it's a completely new idea, sometimes it's just not a good idea for your game, or it's like too difficult to make it work with everything else.
And we have a question from the chat, a little bit of an aside. Have you met Nigel from Flambeer?
No, I actually didn't know he was part of Flambeer. I thought he was some guy at Devolver, so I guess I'm completely out of the loop there.
I think that actually Nigel is from Devolver.
Oh, okay, alright. Well, I could see how it could be confusing because they get basically all their games published by them now.
Yeah. So...
And, Linux testing there. I'll be honest, there's been very little, if any, Linux testing at all by myself. Basically, I just depend on players to test it there. And honestly, it's just because I'm too preoccupied and or lazy, take or pick, to set up a second partition or another machine where I'm running it on Linux. Even though, back in 2001 when I was a teenager, I had 3 different Linux boxes in my room and was a huge Linux nerd. And for that first stint of my AAA experience as a tools coder and did stuff on Linux machines, even though basically I know Linux very well, I haven't really been doing any first-party support for it, but I can basically lean on Unity for a lot of that because it basically just works for the most part for its multi-platform support. And also, if any Linux gamers ever feel a bit left out, they probably already know, but in terms of actual sales, they make up a very tiny minority, and some devs, especially, talking to each other over beers or whatever, just don't want to even bother at all. So, yeah, I can deploy to Linux, and therefore I do, because it would maybe not be, I don't know, I don't see why I shouldn't. But I'm still very sort of sad if there's any sort of major issues with it, and I just sort of feel like, well, I can't really jump onto that because it's only going to happen for 2 or 3 people out of thousands, and that's just the reality. I don't want to sound too uncaring or anything like that, but I want to describe the reality from our end, basically.
Yeah, definitely, because you have to prioritize, especially with limited resources.
Yeah, that's another thing with having tons of ideas. You've always just, in the end, you have to prioritize them. So sometimes you just, especially with the bigger games, at some point in time you just need to get the game out, and usually that will result in a lot of cuts to content, either planned features or features that sort of work but aren't really ready, and it would take too much effort to make them ready. Those things happen a lot in game development. Anytime you play a released game, especially in AAA, there were tons of features that were never started or half implemented that you never saw, or tons of levels that you've never seen because they weren't at the polished level the company wanted them to be. So they just got cut. So yeah. And there's no, unlike movies, there's no DVD extras. There's this crappy gray box level that was going to be in the game, but we didn't have the resources to make it not gray box. But here you go anyways, because this is no, that doesn't happen, as you might notice. Maybe it happens in amazingly rare occasions or something that I don't know about, but generally it doesn't happen.
So we've been talking for about an hour. A few things have been said in the chat. To be honest, Unity does make it pretty easy to deploy multi-platform, so that's absolutely great.
Yes.
the fact, and Asper, someone mentioned Asper, who does Linux and Mac porting, which is really valuable to a lot of people, which is great. And finally, Fabio, which is actually, that's how it's said. It's a lot of F's followed by an Abio. Says, just need to say this, the design is absolutely fantastic. And that sums up my thoughts on the game as well. It's the swooshiest game I've ever played, and I can't wait to see how people react to it.
Yeah, those little, when you fly really fast, those little particles that fly by, they're called swooshies. The actual technical term behind the scenes is swooshies. And they're very important to the feel of the game.
That's amazing. So I want to thank you so much for your time. For those who want to participate in the GamesMatter event, it's happening now at GamesMatter HQ. I'm going to get about the tweet and the games. But yeah, even if you don't pick up a copy from the event today, please support Skyrogue, even if it's just leaving a Steam review, adding it to your wish list, telling your friends. It's an amazing game, and as you guys can hear for yourselves, it's an amazing developer worth supporting. Thank you so much again, man. I wish you the best of success.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it was great.
This has been Nelson for GamesMatter with Kenny Backus, right?
Yes.
Yes, nailed it. This is Nelson for GamesMatter with Kenny Backus of Skyrogue, representing his amazing team. We will see you later.